A struggling auto mechanic in the forgotten industrial town of Millbrook spends his final $200 on medical parts to build a makeshift heart device for a dying 8-year-old girl whose family claims they can't afford proper treatment. For 3 desperate weeks, Ruiz works 18-hour days in his cramped garage, using car parts and salvaged electronics to create what doctors said was impossible: a temporary cardiac support system that could keep little Aria breathing until she could get real medical help. What Gary doesn't know is that this frail child asking for just a few more days to see Christmas is actually the daughter of Dr. Marcus Thorne, one of the world's most renowned cardiac surgeons and billion-dollar medical device inventor who has been secretly testing whether anyone would risk everything to save a stranger's child without expecting fame or fortune in return. Now, as a state-of-the-art medical jet touches down outside Gary's humble garage, its advanced life support systems gleaming in the December snow, both their lives are about to change forever. But will authentic compassion survive when it collides with a world of cutting-edge medicine, corporate boardrooms, and billion-dollar research facilities? Before we dive into this incredible true story, drop a comment below telling us which country you're watching from. And if you believe that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when driven by pure love, smash that subscribe button. Because tomorrow's story about a janitor who became a hero will absolutely blow your mind. Ruiz had been fixing engines since he was 12 years old, learning from his father in the same garage where he now struggled to keep the lights on. At 36, his hands bore the permanent stains of motor oil and metal shavings, and his work coveralls were patched in more places than he could count. The small town of Millbrook, nestled in the Rust Belt valleys of Pennsylvania, had seen better days. Once thriving with 3 major manufacturing plants, the town now echoed with the ghosts of prosperity, its main street dotted with empty storefronts and for lease signs that had been there so long they'd faded in the sun. Gary's Auto Repair sat at the corner of Industrial Avenue and Hope Street, an ironic intersection that perfectly captured the tension between Millbrook's dying industrial past and its residents' stubborn refusal to give up. The building itself was a study in determined survival. Red brick walls that had weathered decades of harsh winters, large windows that let in just enough light to work by, and a hand-painted sign that Gary refreshed every spring with whatever paint he could afford. Inside the garage, every tool had a story. The hydraulic lift that wheezed but still functioned had been his father's first major purchase in 1987. The diagnostic computer, held together with electrical tape and hope, was a graduation gift he'd bought himself when he completed his automotive certification program. The coffee maker in the corner, an ancient percolator that Gary swore made the best coffee in 3 counties, had belonged to his late wife Maria, who used to bring lunch to the mechanics every day until cancer took her 3 years ago. But it was Elena's unconventional approach to problem-solving that set her apart from other mechanics in the region. While her competitors focused solely on automotive repairs, Elena saw connections everywhere. She understood that an internal combustion engine wasn't so different from a heart. Both required precise timing, proper pressure, and unobstructed flow to function optimally. Her unusual perspective had earned her a reputation for fixing vehicles that others had declared hopeless, though it had also earned her some strange looks from traditional mechanics who couldn't understand why she read medical journals in her spare time. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Elena arrived at the garage at 6 a.m., 2 hours before her official opening time, because the quiet early hours allowed her to think clearly and plan her day. She'd always been a morning person, finding peace in the ritual of starting the coffee, checking her appointment book, and mentally preparing for whatever automotive puzzles awaited her. Her appointment book told the story of a community hanging on by its fingernails. Mrs. Patterson needed her 2003 Honda Civic to last another year until her daughter graduated college. The Hendersons were nursing their pickup truck through another winter because buying a new vehicle simply wasn't possible. Even the more affluent residents, like Dr. Williams, who ran the town's only remaining medical practice, drove vehicles that were well past their prime and came to Elena because she charged fair prices and did honest work. Gary's financial situation was precarious but stable in the way that comes from years of careful budgeting and creative problem-solving. He owned the garage outright, a gift from his father that came with the understanding that he would continue serving the community regardless of profit margins. His small apartment above the shop was sparse but functional, furnished with pieces he'd restored himself and heated by a wood stove that he fed with scraps from local construction projects. Since Maria's passing, the space felt too large and too quiet, but it was home, and it was where he was raising his 10-year-old son Miguel on his own. The town of Millbrook might have been forgotten by politicians and economic development committees, but its residents looked out for each other in ways that would surprise outsiders. When Elena's diagnostic computer had failed 6 months earlier, the local electronics teacher had helped her rebuild it using parts donated by families throughout the community. When the garage's roof leaked last spring, a dozen neighbors had shown up with tools and materials, turning a potential disaster into an impromptu community workday.
This spirit of mutual support extended to Elena's approach to business. She'd developed an informal sliding scale for pricing that took into account what people could afford, often accepting payment in trade or allowing customers to work off their bills by helping with other projects around the garage. Her bookkeeping was unconventional but heartfelt. She kept detailed notes about each customer's situation alongside their repair records, ensuring that no one would be turned away because of temporary financial hardship. But December had been particularly challenging. The holiday season always meant increased expenses for her customers, which translated to delayed payments for Elena. 3 major repairs had been completed on handshake agreements with families who promised to pay after the new year. The garage's heating bill was overdue, and Elena had been supplementing the furnace with space heaters that she knew were driving up the electric bill to unsustainable levels. Still, Elena faced each day with the same determination that had carried her through automotive school as the only woman in her class, through the early years of proving herself in a male-dominated industry, and through the gradual economic decline that had claimed so many of her neighbors' livelihoods. She had inherited more than just tools and a building from her grandfather. She had inherited a philosophy that viewed mechanical problems as puzzles to be solved with creativity, persistence, and an unwavering belief that there was always a solution if you were willing to look hard enough. As Elena settled into her morning routine on what would become the most important day of her life, she had no idea that her unique combination of mechanical expertise, medical curiosity, and generous heart was about to be tested in ways she never could have imagined. The sound of footsteps on gravel would soon announce the arrival of a small girl with a failing heart and a story that would challenge everything Elena thought she knew about the limits of what one person could accomplish with determination, compassion, and a garage full of tools. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The December frost painted intricate patterns across the garage windows as Gary Ruiz completed his morning inspection of the tools that would determine whether he could keep his doors open another month. His father's legacy weighed heavily in his calloused hands, a complete set of precision instruments that had served 3 generations of Ruiz mechanics, now bearing the responsibility of sustaining not just Gary's livelihood, but the transportation needs of an entire struggling community while supporting his 10-year-old son, Miguel. Millbrook's economic reality was written in the faces of Gary's customers and the vehicles they drove. The town's population had shrunk from 15,000 to barely 6,000 over the past 2 decades, as the closure of Riverside Manufacturing, Millbrook Steelworks, and finally the automotive parts plant had sent families searching for opportunities in larger cities. Those who remained were bound by roots too deep to abandon, by elderly parents who couldn't be moved, or by the simple faith that their community would somehow find a way to survive. Gary understood this loyalty intimately, but his commitment was complicated by single parenthood. He'd had offers to relocate his skills to Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, where certified mechanics with his reputation could earn 3 times what he managed in Millbrook. But leaving felt impossible, not just because of loyalty to his father's memory, but because Miguel had already lost his mother, and disrupting the community connections that provided stability seemed cruel. Customers like Martha Henley, whose 1998 Toyota Camry was her only connection to medical appointments, or Jim Patterson, whose delivery truck supported 4 families through his small logistics business, had become extended family in ways that went beyond automotive maintenance. The garage itself reflected Gary's resourcefulness and the community's collective investment in his success. When the original hydraulic system had failed 2 years ago, the high school's shop class had made rebuilding it their semester project, with Miguel watching proudly from the sidelines as his father guided older students through complex mechanical repairs. When Gary needed specialized diagnostic software he couldn't afford, Dr. Rachel Williams, Millbrook's overworked family physician who had treated Maria during her final months, had bartered medical care for Gary and Miguel in exchange for maintaining her clinic's small fleet of vehicles. This intricate network of mutual dependence created an economy that functioned outside traditional business models. Gary's customer relationships were built on trust, necessity, and shared understanding that everyone was doing their best with limited resources. His pricing structure had evolved into a complex system that considered not just parts and labor, but family circumstances, seasonal employment fluctuations, and the broader health of the local economy. Single parenthood had made him particularly sensitive to other family struggles. He never charged full rates to households with children, understanding firsthand how quickly unexpected expenses could devastate a family budget. Gary's apartment above the garage told its own story of determined frugality and the challenges of single parenthood. The living room served double duty as Miguel's homework space and Gary's technical library, with automotive manuals sharing shelf space with Miguel's school books and art supplies. Furniture came from estate sales and roadside discards that Gary had restored with the same attention to detail he applied to engine rebuilds, often with Miguel's help during weekend projects that combined family time with practical skill building.
The kitchen showed evidence of a father learning to manage household responsibilities that Maria had once handled effortlessly. Gary had taught himself to cook nutritious meals on a budget, though their freezer was admittedly heavy on frozen convenience foods during particularly busy work periods. A bulletin board beside the refrigerator displayed Miguel's school achievements, maintenance schedules for customer vehicles, and the carefully budgeted monthly expenses that governed their financial survival. Miguel's bedroom was Gary's pride, the one area where budget constraints never applied. Despite their financial limitations, Gary had ensured his son had quality educational materials, age-appropriate technology for schoolwork, and enough space for the collections of rocks, model airplanes, and electronics projects that reflected the boy's growing technical curiosity. A desk by the window overlooked the garage, allowing Miguel to observe his father's work while completing homework, fostering an appreciation for craftsmanship and problem-solving that was already evident in the child's approach to school projects. But Gary's most distinctive characteristic remained his intellectual curiosity, particularly regarding the intersection of mechanical and biological systems. His personal library, now sharing space with Miguel's growing collection, contained an eclectic mix of automotive manuals, medical textbooks, engineering journals, and theoretical physics papers that he'd collected from university discards and online sources. This unconventional education had intensified during Maria's illness, when months of hospital visits and medical consultations had led him to explore how mechanical principles applied to living systems. The medical knowledge Gary had acquired wasn't purely academic. During Maria's treatment, he had learned to operate complex monitoring equipment, understand pharmaceutical interactions, and recognize symptoms that required immediate medical attention. This practical experience with medical technology had revealed striking parallels between automotive diagnostics and patient monitoring systems. Both involved tracking multiple variables, identifying patterns that indicated system stress, and implementing interventions to prevent catastrophic failure. Gary's workshop reflected this interdisciplinary approach to problem solving. Alongside traditional automotive tools were precision electronics instruments, medical reference materials, and experimental devices he'd built to test theories about pressure dynamics, electrical conductivity, and fluid mechanics. His most prized possession was a digital oscilloscope he'd assembled from salvaged components, capable of visualizing electrical patterns in both automotive systems and, theoretically, biological processes. Miguel had learned to help with basic measurements, demonstrating the same intuitive understanding of complex systems that had characterized Gary's own childhood apprenticeship. The financial pressures Gary faced as a single father were substantial, but manageable through careful planning and community support. His monthly expenses totaled approximately $2,800, rent-free living above the garage, utilities averaging $180, food costs for himself and Miguel kept reasonable through bulk purchasing and home cooking, Miguel's school and activity expenses, and business costs that fluctuated based on parts needs and equipment maintenance. His average monthly income varied dramatically, from $2,100 during slow periods to $4,500 during busy months, creating a feast or famine cycle that required constant attention to cash flow management and strategic timing of major expenses. Single parenthood had taught Gary to plan months ahead for Miguel's needs. School supplies purchased during back-to-school sales, winter clothing bought at end-of-season clearances, Christmas and birthday gifts acquired gradually throughout the year when opportunities arose. This forward-thinking approach extended to his business operations, where he maintained detailed projections of seasonal demand patterns and potential equipment failures that could disrupt his income stream. December represented Gary's most challenging financial period, combining reduced customer spending with increased heating costs and the pressure of providing Miguel with a memorable Christmas despite budget constraints. This particular December had been especially difficult. 3 major repair jobs completed on credit for families facing temporary hardships, an unexpected furnace repair that consumed his emergency fund, and a diagnostic computer malfunction that required expensive replacement parts. With Miguel's Christmas list posted on the refrigerator and bills accumulating on his desk, Gary felt the familiar weight of trying to provide stability while operating on margins that left no room for error. Despite these pressures, Gary maintained his father's philosophy of community service above profit maximization, a commitment that had become more complex since becoming a single parent. He'd never repossessed a vehicle for non-payment, never charged emergency rates for after-hours repairs, and never turned away a customer whose transportation needs were critical to employment or family care. This approach had earned him fierce loyalty from customers who recommended his services throughout the region, but it also meant operating on margins that required constant vigilance and occasional personal sacrifice. The relationships Gary had built extended far beyond business transactions into a network of mutual support that helped sustain both his family and his customers. He knew which customers were diabetic and kept emergency supplies on hand, understood which families were struggling with unemployment and adjusted payment schedules accordingly, and maintained detailed records that allowed him to predict and prevent expensive problems. His role as a single parent had connected him with other parents throughout the community, creating informal arrangements for childcare during emergency repairs, shared transportation to school events, and collective purchasing of bulk supplies that reduced costs for everyone. Gary's reputation for creative problem-solving had made him an unofficial community consultant for any mechanical challenge, but single parenthood had added another dimension to his role. Parents throughout Millbrook brought their children's broken bicycles, electronic toys, and science fair projects to Gary's garage, knowing he would take time to explain repair processes and teach basic technical skills. Miguel often assisted with these informal education sessions, developing social connections with other children while learning to share his father's knowledge. As Gary organized his workspace for another day of balancing automotive repairs with the constant awareness of time constraints imposed by school schedules and parental responsibilities, he had no way of knowing that his unique combination of technical expertise, creative thinking, and compassionate problem-solving was about to be tested in ways that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between automotive mechanics and medical intervention.
The sound that changed Gary's life forever was barely audible,
The soft scrape of worn sneakers against gravel, accompanied by labored breathing that seemed far too strained for such a gentle approach. It was 7:43 a.m. on December 15th, and Gary was reviewing McGill's math homework at his workbench while calibrating his oscilloscope, trying to balance his parental duties with the technical demands of his morning routine when the garage's motion sensor chimed. He looked up to see a small figure silhouetted against the bright morning light streaming through the open door, and his father's instincts immediately kicked into high alert. A child, alone, clearly in distress. Every protective impulse Gary had developed since Miguel's birth fired simultaneously. As his eyes adjusted, his breath caught in his throat at what he saw. A girl, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, stood unsteadily in the doorway, one small hand pressed against her chest in a gesture Gary recognized with chilling familiarity from Maria's final months. The other hand clutched a worn teddy bear that had clearly seen years of devoted companionship, but it was the child's overall condition that made Gary's stomach clench with concern. Her olive complexion had an unhealthy pallor with a subtle blue tinge around her lips that Gary had learned to fear during the endless hours he'd spent monitoring Maria's oxygen levels. The girl's dark hair hung in limp strands around a face that was beautiful despite its obvious exhaustion, and her large brown eyes held an intelligence that seemed incongruous with her fragile physical state. Everything about her posture and breathing pattern screamed medical emergency to Gary's trained eye. "Are you the man who fixes things that are broken?" the girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper, each word separated by careful breaths as if speaking required significant effort. Gary immediately dropped to one knee, bringing himself to the child's eye level, a technique he perfected with Miguel and refined through his interactions with other customers' children. "I'm Gary," he said gently, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to reassuring frightened people. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Aria," the girl replied, managing a weak smile that reminded Gary painfully of how Miguel looked when he was trying to be brave about something that scared him. "Aria Sinclair. Mama said you can fix anything with an engine, and—" she paused, pressing her hand more firmly against her chest, "and I was wondering if you could fix my heart. It keeps skipping and making funny noises, just like when my friend's daddy's truck engine used to sputter before it broke down completely." The simple honesty of the request hit Gary with the force of every nightmare he'd experienced as a parent. In his years of mechanical work, he'd encountered countless analogies between human bodies and machines, but never from someone so young and never delivered with such heartbreaking matter-of-factness. This child was asking him to essentially perform medical intervention using automotive expertise, and the trust implicit in that request was both humbling and terrifying. Gary's medical knowledge, acquired during Maria's illness, immediately began processing what he was observing. The child's breathing pattern suggested significant cardiac insufficiency, her skin tone indicated poor circulation, and the way she instinctively supported herself against the doorframe revealed the kind of systemic fatigue that Gary had learned to associate with organ failure. These weren't symptoms that belonged in an 8-year-old's experience, yet Aria spoke about her condition with the weary acceptance of someone much older. "Aria, honey, where are your parents?" Gary asked, scanning the empty lot behind the child for any sign of adult supervision while simultaneously calculating how quickly he could get her to Dr. Williams' clinic if her condition deteriorated. "Did someone bring you here?" Aria shook her head slowly, the movement seeming to require considerable effort. "Mama is at work cleaning the big medical building downtown. She leaves real early, before I wake up sometimes. And my daddy—" Her voice trailed off, and she clutched her teddy bear tighter. "My daddy went away when I got sick. Mama says he couldn't handle watching me get worse." Gary felt his heart clench at the matter-of-fact way this child described abandonment and struggle, recognizing the emotional landscape of single parenthood from the child's perspective. Miguel had asked similar questions about why some fathers left when families faced medical crises, and Gary had struggled to provide answers that preserved faith in human dignity while acknowledging harsh realities. "How did you get here, sweetheart?" This is pretty far from the residential areas, and it's very cold outside." "I walked," she said simply, and Gary realized that her jacket was inadequate for December weather, her cheeks reddened by cold as well as exertion. "It took a really long time, and I had to stop lots of times to catch my breath. But Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store told Mama that you fixed her grandson's bicycle when all the other repair shops said it was hopeless. She said you have magic hands that can make broken things work again, just like my mama needs someone to make her heart stop hurting when she looks at me." The implication of what Gary was hearing made him physically nauseated. This child had walked several miles through December weather, clearly in significant cardiac distress, because someone had mentioned his reputation for solving impossible problems. The trust implicit in that journey was both humbling and terrifying, but more disturbing with the child's understanding of her mother's emotional pain, a level of awareness that reminded Gary of Miguel's prematurity during Maria's illness. Gary's medical knowledge, gleaned from years of managing Maria's complex treatment regimen, immediately recognized the severity of the situation. Aria's symptoms suggested advanced congestive heart failure, possibly complicated by structural defects that were progressively worsening. Without immediate medical intervention, the child's condition would likely deteriorate rapidly, a timeline that Gary understood with devastating clarity from personal experience. "Aria, this is very important," Gary said, keeping his voice calm despite his growing alarm. "Have you seen a doctor about your heart? Are you taking any medicine?" The girl's expression grew sad in a way that reminded Gary of Miguel's face when discussing topics that were too adult for his age. "We went to the emergency room 3 times, but they said we need to see a special heart doctor, and Mama says the insurance won't cover it, and we can't afford to pay ourselves. They gave me some pills that were supposed to help, but we ran out last week, and the pharmacy wants more money than Mama makes in a whole month." Gary's hands clenched involuntarily as he processed this information. Here was a child with potentially life-threatening cardiac problems, unable to access appropriate medical care due to financial constraints, walking miles in dangerous weather to ask a mechanic for help because she'd literally run out of other options. The parallels to his own family's medical struggles were immediate and painful. He remembered the crushing weight of insurance denials, the impossible choices between medication and rent, the desperation that led to considering any alternative when conventional care became financially impossible. His father's voice echoed in his memory, but now it carried additional weight from his experience as both a widower and a single parent. "Mijo, a real mechanic doesn't just fix what's broken. He finds a way to make it work, even when everyone else says it's impossible. And sometimes, the most important repairs aren't the ones that pay the bills." "Aria," Gary said carefully, his voice carrying the same tone he used when explaining complex concepts to Miguel. "I need you to understand something very important. I'm not a doctor, and hearts are much more complicated than car engines. What you're asking, it's very dangerous, and I don't want to hurt you by trying something I'm not trained for." Aria nodded solemnly, displaying the same serious attention to adult conversations that Gary had learned to expect from children who had been forced to mature beyond their years by medical crises. "I know you're not a doctor, but the doctors can't help me because we don't have enough money, and my heart is getting worse every day. Mama tries not to let me see her crying, but I hear her at night, and I know she's scared. If you can't help me—" Her voice grew smaller, carrying the weight of understanding that Gary wished no child ever had to bear. "I just want to see Christmas. That's only 10 days away. If my heart could just work a little bit longer, maybe until after Santa comes?" The raw honesty of the child's words hit Gary like a physical blow. Here was an 8-year-old who understood she was dying, who had walked miles seeking help from a stranger, asking not for a miracle cure, but simply for enough time to experience one more Christmas. The request resonated with every sleepless night Gary had spent during Maria's illness, every desperate prayer for just a little bit more time, just one more holiday, just enough strength to see their son grow up a little longer. Gary looked around his workshop, seeing it suddenly through new eyes. the precision electronic equipment he'd acquired for automotive diagnostics, the pressure monitoring systems he'd built for performance engine testing, the fluid dynamics knowledge he'd developed over decades of optimizing complex mechanical systems. Could these tools, designed for automotive applications, possibly be adapted for something far more critical? The rational part of his mind screamed warnings about liability, medical licensing, the impossibility of what was being asked. But the larger part of his mind, the part shaped by watching his wife die despite having access to the best medical care money could buy, the part that understood what it meant to be a parent facing the unthinkable, was already analyzing the problem, considering possibilities, remembering every medical journal he'd read during those long nights in hospital waiting rooms. "Aria," he said finally, "I need to make some phone calls and do some research. Can you sit here quietly while I think about this? And I'm going to call your mama to let her know where you are, okay? I don't want her to be scared." As Aria settled carefully onto the old chair where Miguel sometimes did homework while watching Gary work, still clutching her teddy bear, Gary realized that everything in his life, every medical crisis he navigated, every engineering challenge he'd solved, every impossible repair he'd completed, had led to this moment. Every skill he'd acquired, every tool he'd collected, every lesson he'd learned about the intersection of mechanical systems and biological function was about to be tested in the most important challenge of his career. He had no idea that this small, brave child was about to become the catalyst for a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between automotive mechanics and medical intervention, between what was possible and what was merely profitable, between the limits of one person's expertise and the boundless reach of genuine compassion. Gary's hands trembled slightly as he dialed the number on Aria's emergency contact card, a worn piece of paper the child had pulled from her jacket pocket with the careful movements of someone who had learned to conserve energy for essential tasks. The phone rang 4 times before a tired voice answered, and Gary found himself thinking of all the similar calls he'd received about Miguel during school emergencies. "Carmen's cleaning service, this is Carmen speaking." "Miss Sinclair, this is Gary Ruiz from Ruiz Auto Repair on Industrial Avenue. Your daughter Aria is here at my shop, and she's safe, but we need to talk." The silence on the other end stretched for several heartbeats before Carmen Sinclair's voice returned, filled with the kind of panic Gary recognized from his own parenting emergencies. "Aria, how did she? I left her sleeping with medication to help her rest. She's supposed to stay in bed when I'm working. Is she breathing okay? Please tell me her lips aren't blue." The specificity of Carmen's medical concerns immediately told Gary that this mother understood her daughter's condition far better than most parents would. "She walked here, Miss Sinclair, several miles in this weather. She's asking me to help with her heart condition because she says doctors are too expensive." "Oh, God!" Carmen's voice cracked in a way that reminded Gary of his own breaking point during Maria's illness. "I'll be right there. Please don't let her walk anywhere else. Sometimes when her oxygen levels drop, she gets confused about distances and safety." 30 minutes later, a battered Honda Accord pulled into the garage lot, and Gary watched a woman who couldn't have been older than 35 emerge, moving with the exhausted urgency of someone who had been running on empty for too long. Carmen Sinclair wore a cleaning company uniform that showed the wear patterns Gary recognized from his own work clothes, fabric stress points that came from physical labor, chemical stains that never quite washed out, patches where tears had been carefully mended rather than replaced. The reunion between mother and daughter was both tender and heartbreaking. Carmen dropped to her knees beside Aria's chair, going through what was clearly an established routine, checking her daughter's breathing pattern, feeling her forehead for fever, examining her fingernails for color changes that would indicate circulation problems. Gary watched this medical assessment with the recognition of someone who had performed similar checks on Miguel during illness.
but Carmen's expertise suggested training that went beyond typical parental concern. "Mija, you can't just walk away like that," Carmen whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Your heart can't handle that kind of exertion. You scared me so much." "I'm sorry, Mama," Aria replied, her small hand touching her mother's cheek with the gentle authority of a child who had learned to comfort distressed adults. "But I heard you on the phone last night with the insurance company, and I know they said no again, so I came to ask the engine man if he could help us find another way." Gary cleared his throat gently, drawing both their attention while giving them a moment to compose themselves. "Miss Sinclair, I think we need to have an honest conversation about what Aria is asking me to do, and I think Miguel should be part of this discussion too." Carmen looked up, confused. "Miguel, my son, he's 10 and he's going to be home from school soon. If I'm going to attempt something this significant, something that will require weeks of 18-hour days and probably every dollar I have saved, Miguel needs to understand why his father is making choices that will affect our entire family." Gary pulled out his phone to check the time. "He walks home from school at 3:30, and he always comes straight to the garage to show me his homework. This conversation is going to change our lives, and he deserves to be included." Carmen stood slowly, her protective instincts clearly warring against her desperation. "Mr. Ruiz, I appreciate your kindness, but my daughter needs real medical care, no offense, but you're a mechanic, and you have your own family to think about." "You're absolutely right," Gary replied, walking to his workbench where his medical reference materials were scattered alongside automotive manuals. "I'm a mechanic with a family to support, but I'm also someone who spent 2 years learning to operate complex medical monitoring equipment, understand pharmaceutical interactions, and recognize cardiac symptoms because my wife had a heart condition that ultimately took her life." He picked up a medical journal he'd been reading the night before, one focused on mechanical cardiac assist devices. "I'm someone who understands fluid dynamics and pressure regulation, who has built precision electronic control systems, and who might be able to construct a temporary cardiac support device that could buy Aria time until you can access proper medical care or find a clinical trial that accepts patients with your insurance status."
The words hung in the air between them, impossible and terrifying, and filled with desperate hope. Carmen's face cycled through disbelief, fear, in something that might have been the first spark of hope she'd felt in months. That's not possible," Carmen said weakly, but Gary could hear the question in her voice. "Those devices cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. They require surgical teams to implant." Gary pulled out his tablet and showed Carmen a schematic he'd been working on during Aria's brief nap, basic concepts sketched while his mind processed the engineering challenges. External ventricular assist devices exist. They're essentially specialized pumps that help the heart move blood more efficiently. The principles aren't fundamentally different from automotive fuel injection systems, just applied to biological circulation instead of internal combustion. He pointed to various components on his drawing. "I have precision pumps from hydraulic systems, microcontrollers from engine management computers, pressure sensors, flow meters, and access to medical-grade tubing through Dr. Williams. The biggest challenge would be creating a sterile, biocompatible interface and ensuring the timing synchronizes properly with Aria's existing heartbeat." The sound of school bus brakes outside announced Miguel's arrival, and Gary felt his stomach clench with the knowledge that the next few minutes would define his son's immediate future. Miguel burst through the door with his usual after-school energy, backpacks slung over one shoulder, but stopped abruptly when he saw the visitors. "Papa, who are they?" Miguel asked in Spanish, a habit they maintained to preserve his connection to Maria's family. "Miguel, come here, Mijillo. I need you to meet some people, and we need to have a very important conversation." Gary switched to English, placing his hand on his son's shoulder. "This is Miss Sinclair and her daughter Aria. Aria is 8 years old, and she has a heart condition that's very serious." Miguel looked at Aria with the immediate empathy of a child who had watched his own mother struggle with medical problems. "Is she going to be okay?
Can the doctors fix her heart? That's what we need to talk about, Gary said, kneeling to Miguel's eye level. The doctors want to help Aria, but her family doesn't have enough money for the treatment she needs. Aria came here today asking if I could build something to help her heart work better, using the same skills I used to fix cars. Miguel's eyes widened as he processed this information. Like when you fixed Mrs. Patterson's car when she said she couldn't afford to take it to the dealer? Similar, but much more serious and much more dangerous. If I try to help Aria, I'll need to work many extra hours every day for weeks, and I'll need to spend money that we were saving for other things. That might mean a smaller Christmas this year and less time for me to help you with your homework. Carmen started to protest. Mr. Ruiz, you can't ask your son to sacrifice. Yes, he can, Miguel interrupted, with the directness that Gary had learned to expect from children who had faced adult realities too early. He looked directly at Aria, who was watching the conversation with intense focus. Aria, are you scared about your heart? Aria nodded. Sometimes. But mostly I'm sad that my mama cries when she thinks I'm sleeping. Miguel turned back to his father. Papa, remember when Mama was sick and you worked extra jobs to pay for her medicine and we had to eat pasta for dinner every night for 2 months? Gary nodded, remembering those desperate times when every financial decision carried life or death implications. I was hungry sometimes, but I was proud that you were fighting to save Mama, even when it was hard. If you can maybe save Aria's life, then we should try, even if it means pasta dinners again. Gary felt tears threatening as he looked at his son, seeing Maria's generous heart reflected in the boy's willingness to sacrifice for a stranger. Miguel, what I'm considering is very risky. I might not be able to help Aria at all, and we might lose the money anyway. But if you don't try something, then Aria might die for sure, right? The simple logic of a child's moral reasoning cut through all of Gary's adult concerns about liability, financial risk, and professional limitations. Yes, mijo, if we don't try something, Aria will probably die. Then we try, Miguel said firmly, then looked at Carmen with the solemn authority that children sometimes possess in moments of crisis. Miss Sinclair, my papa is really good at fixing things that other people say are broken forever. And if he says he can help Aria, then I think he can. Gary looked at his son, then at Aria, then at Carmen, who was crying openly now. Miss Sinclair, I need complete honesty about Aria's medical history, access to all her test results and medications, and your permission to contact other professionals who might be able to help. And I hesitated, then forged ahead. Your acceptance that this is experimental, unproven, and dangerous. I can't promise it will work. I can only promise that I'll give it everything I have. Aria spoke up from her chair, her voice soft but clear. Mr. Gary, if you can give me even one more Christmas with my mama and maybe let me meet Miguel's friends at school, it will be worth any risk. I'm not afraid of trying. I'm only afraid of giving up before Christmas comes.
In that moment, Gary made the commitment that would define not just the rest of his life, but his son's understanding of what it meant to be a man, a father, and a member of a community that looked out for its most vulnerable members. He was going to attempt to build a cardiac assist device in an automotive garage, using car parts and determination, because a dying child had asked him to, and because his own son had just taught him that some risks were worth taking regardless of the cost. Miguel, he said, go get your homework. We're going to have some very busy weeks ahead of us, and I'm going to need my best assistant to help me save a life. The transformation of Gary's garage from automotive repair shop to makeshift biomedical laboratory began within hours of his commitment to Aria, but unlike a solitary mechanic working alone, Gary's project became a complex orchestration of family life, community involvement, and technical innovation that required constant balancing of competing demands. Miguel had insisted on staying after school to observe the project's early stages, setting up his homework station on a workbench that Gary quickly converted into a combination study area and sterile workspace.
The sight of his 10-year-old son completing math problems while Gary sterilized automotive tools for medical applications created a surreal but oddly comforting atmosphere that reminded Gary of the adaptability families developed during medical crises. Word of the project spread through Millbrook's tight-knit community with the speed that only small-town networks could achieve. By late afternoon, Gary's shop had become an unlikely hub of collaborative expertise, but with the added complexity of maintaining normal business operations and family routines that a single father couldn't simply abandon. Professor Margaret Chen from the Regional Community College's engineering program arrived as Gary was attempting to balance dinner preparation for Miguel with pressure testing of salvaged hydraulic components. She carried a carload of textbooks and a portable cleanroom setup, but also brought homemade soup and sandwiches that she insisted Gary and Miguel eat while working. "Single parents don't have the luxury of skipping meals," she announced with the authority of someone who had raised her own children while pursuing advanced degrees. "And children need routine during stressful times, even when their fathers are attempting medical miracles." Behind her came Tommy Brennan, the high school's electronics teacher, wheeling in a cart full of precision instruments, but also bringing his own teenage son, David, to help with childcare duties. David immediately began helping Miguel with homework, creating an impromptu tutoring session that allowed Gary to focus on technical challenges without worrying about his son's educational needs. Dr. Rachel Williams appeared just as Gary was attempting to sterilize a workspace using automotive cleaning solvents while simultaneously preparing Miguel's bedtime snack. She carried a proper medical equipment sterilizer that she'd somehow convinced the regional hospital to loan out, but also brought pediatric monitoring equipment that she set up as much for Miguel's peace of mind as for Aria's medical needs. "Children worry more when they don't understand what's happening," Dr. Williams explained to Gary while showing both Miguel and Aria how the monitoring systems worked. "If Miguel can see that we're being scientific and careful, he'll worry less about his father attempting medical miracles." But it was Aria herself who became the most challenging and rewarding aspect of the project's family dynamic. Despite her physical limitations, the 8-year-old displayed an intuitive understanding of the device's requirements that surprised even Gary. But her presence also created complex interactions with Miguel that required constant parental attention. Miguel had initially approached Aria with the careful courtesy he'd learned to show towards sick adults, but within hours, the children had developed a friendship that transcended the medical crisis. Aria's technical questions about the device became collaborative discussions between the children, with Miguel translating Gary's explanations into language that made sense to both of them. "The tube that connects to your chest, it should be long enough so you can still sit at a desk to do homework. And maybe you could have colors that change when everything's working right, like the diagnostic lights on Papa's computer." Gary found himself incorporating these suggestions not just because they came from the children, but because they revealed practical considerations that improved the overall design. Miguel's suggestion about homework positioning led Gary to research ergonomic factors that enhanced patient comfort, while Aria's request for visual feedback systems resulted in monitoring displays that were both functional and reassuring. The technical challenges proved more complex than Gary had initially anticipated, particularly when balanced against the demands of single parenthood. Synchronizing an external pump with a failing heart required precision timing that pushed his automotive control systems far beyond their intended applications. But he had to accomplish this work in segments between preparing Miguel's meals, checking homework, and maintaining the bedtime routines that provided stability during this chaotic period. "The human heart isn't just a pump," Professor Chen explained during one of their late evening problem-solving sessions, after Miguel had fallen asleep on a cot Gary had set up in the garage's office area. "It's a precisely choreographed electrical and mechanical system. If our device's timing is off by even fractions of a second, we could trigger arrhythmias that might be worse than the original heart failure."
Gary absorbed this information while simultaneously monitoring Miguel's sleep and adjusting the workshop's heating to ensure his son stayed comfortable. His background in performance engine tuning had taught him to optimize complex systems with multiple variables, but the stakes had never quite been so literal, and the working conditions had never required such careful attention to family needs alongside technical demands.
As the days progressed, an unexpected dynamic developed between the three children, Miguel, Aria, and Tommy Brennan's son, David, who would become a regular presence as the project consumed more of the adults' time. The older boys took protective roles with Aria, creating games that allowed her to participate despite her physical limitations, while Aria's questions about the technical work often led to educational sessions that benefited all the children. "Why does your heart need help moving the blood?" Aria asked one afternoon, watching Gary calibrate pressure sensors while Miguel and David worked on a school science project that had somehow become integrated with cardiac device research. "In the hospital, they said my heart was tired, but hearts aren't supposed to get tired like people do, are they?" Gary paused in his work, realizing that explaining cardiac failure to three children might actually help him understand the problem more clearly. "Your heart is a muscle, just like the muscles in your arms and legs. But unlike other muscles, your heart never gets to rest. It has to keep working every second of every day, pumping blood to every part of your body." He picked up a small pump from his workbench, one designed for circulating coolant in high-performance automotive applications. Sometimes, if a muscle has to work too hard for too long, it gets weak and tired. That's what happened to your heart. The device we're building is like having helpers, like when Miguel and David help me carry heavy tools so I can still do my work but without getting too tired. Miguel immediately grasped the analogy. "Like when Mama was sick and we had to help her with things she used to do by herself so she could save her energy for getting better?" "Exactly like that," Gary confirmed, and realized that his son had just provided him with the perfect framework for explaining the device's function to medical professionals who might question the project. Carmen's presence during these sessions added another layer of complexity to the family dynamics surrounding the project. Gary watched this young mother struggle with hope and terror in equal measure, but he also noticed that her interactions with Miguel showed unusual sensitivity to the needs of children who had experienced medical trauma in their families. "I keep thinking I should stop this," Carmen confided to Gary during a quiet moment while the three children were absorbed in designing decorative elements for Aria's device. "What kind of mother lets a mechanic perform experimental medical procedures on her child?" But then I remember that we've already tried everything conventional medicine can offer within our financial means. Gary understood Carmen's impossible position, filtered through his own experience of making desperate medical decisions. "You're not letting a mechanic experiment on your child," he replied, gesturing toward the collaborative workspace where Professor Chen was reviewing biomedical engineering principles with Dr. Williams, while Tommy supervised the children's contribution to control system design. "You're allowing a team of professionals to attempt an unconventional solution with medical oversight and community support. I'm just the one with the garage and the tools to put it all together." As the device began to take shape, Gary noticed that it was becoming something more elegant and sophisticated than purely functional requirements would dictate. The housing incorporated Miguel's suggestions for user-friendly interfaces, Aria's requests for reassuring visual indicators, and David's contributions toward making the external components less clinically intimidating. Even the power supply had been designed with backup systems and safety features that exceeded automotive standards, influenced by Gary's determination that nothing he built for a child would ever fail due to insufficient redundancy. The most challenging aspect of the project proved to be managing the psychological pressure of working under extreme time constraints while maintaining normal family life for Miguel. Christmas was now only 6 days away.
Aria's condition was visibly deteriorating, and every technical setback felt like a countdown to tragedy. Gary found himself working 18-hour days, catching brief naps on the office cot beside Miguel, surviving on coffee and the meals that community members brought regularly. But it was during these intense work sessions that Gary began to notice inconsistencies in Aria's background that his single-father instincts found troubling. The child's vocabulary occasionally included medical terms that seemed advanced for her age and circumstances, and she sometimes demonstrated knowledge of cardiac physiology that suggested more extensive medical education than Carmen had described. Her questions about the device often revealed understanding of engineering principles that reminded Gary uncomfortably of Miguel's premature sophistication about adult topics, the kind of knowledge children acquired when they had been exposed to situations beyond their developmental readiness. Most puzzling was Aria's unusual composure when discussing technical aspects of her condition. While she showed appropriate childhood emotions about pain and fear, her intellectual engagement with the medical and engineering challenges seemed remarkably sophisticated. Gary began to wonder if the child's extensive medical experiences had simply accelerated her learning, or if there was something about Aria's background that Carmen hadn't fully shared, perhaps additional medical consultations or treatment attempts that might affect the device's design requirements. Despite these growing questions, Gary's commitment to the project only deepened as he watched the device near completion. Whether or not he fully understood his patient's circumstances, he was certain of one thing: a child's life hung in balance, and he possessed the skills, resources, and community support to potentially save that life. More importantly, Miguel was watching every aspect of this process, learning lessons about courage, community responsibility, and the moral obligation to help others when you had the ability to do so.
With Christmas approaching and the device nearly ready for testing, Gary had no idea that his dedication to saving one child while maintaining his responsibility to his own son was about to reveal secrets that would transform his understanding of everything he thought he knew about his patient, his community, and the true scope of what they were attempting to accomplish together. The first truly puzzling incident occurred on December 19th, when Gary arrived at his garage at 5 a.m. to find Aria already there, sitting quietly in her usual corner with a steaming cup of perfectly prepared coffee and what appeared to be an advanced biomedical engineering journal spread across her lap. More concerning was that Miguel was also present, wide awake, and engaged in what looked like a sophisticated technical discussion with an 8-year-old who supposedly had limited medical knowledge. "Good morning, Mr. Gary," Aria said cheerfully, closing the journal with practiced ease while Miguel looked up from where he'd been sketching modifications to the device schematic. "Miguel and I wanted to get here early to discuss the flow dynamics optimization before you start calibrating the pressure sensors. We've been thinking about the pulse timing synchronization overnight." Gary stood frozen in the doorway, his keys still in his hand, processing multiple impossibilities simultaneously. Miguel should have been asleep in his bed upstairs. Gary had checked on him at midnight, and his son had never shown any tendency toward early rising. The coffee was clearly fresh and expertly prepared, not something either child could have managed independently using the garage's temperamental percolator. Most unsettling was the casual way Aria had pronounced flow dynamics optimization and pulse timing synchronization, technical terms that even some of Gary's engineering colleagues used incorrectly. "Miguel, mijo, how did you get down here without me hearing you? And how did you both make coffee?" Miguel exchanged a quick glance with Aria before answering, a look that made Gary's parental instincts fire warning signals. "I couldn't sleep because I kept thinking about the pressure calculations, Papa. Aria was already here when I came downstairs, and she knew how to work the coffee machine better than I do." "Aria, sweetheart, how did you get here so early? Where's your mother, and how did you travel across town by yourself when you can barely walk to the corner without getting exhausted?" Aria's composure wavered for just a moment, barely perceptible, but Gary's experience reading Miguel's tells caught the hesitation.
Oh, Mama had to start her early shift at the regional medical center today. At the medical office building. She cleans there sometimes, and she arranged for someone to bring me. Gary's mechanical mind, trained to notice inconsistencies in complex systems and sharpened by single parenthood's constant vigilance, immediately flagged multiple problems with this explanation. Carmen had always described her work as general commercial cleaning, never mentioning medical facilities specifically. The logistics didn't make sense. Who would transport a critically ill child across town in pre-dawn darkness? And most troubling, Aria's knowledge of the coffee machine's quirks suggested familiarity with the garage that extended far beyond her supposed recent visits. As Gary began his morning routine, he watched both children with heightened attention. Miguel's behavior seemed normal, but unusually focused, as if he'd been coached on specific topics to discuss. Aria's movements around the garage showed a level of comfort with technical equipment that should have required months of observation to develop. When Gary accidentally knocked over a container of precision electronics components, both children immediately began sorting them by function and specification, a collaborative efficiency that suggested they'd worked together on similar tasks before. "Aria, how do you know so much about electronics components?" Gary asked, crouching beside the children as they organized microcontrollers by processor speed and memory capacity. Aria's hands stilled for just a moment, the same tell Gary had learned to recognize in Miguel when his son was constructing careful explanations around partial truths. "My daddy used to work with computers before he left. He taught me some things about electronics and circuits." But Gary remembered Carmen's earlier description of Aria's father as someone who couldn't handle her getting sick. That narrative didn't align with a man who would have taught his daughter advanced electronic sorting techniques. The pieces of Aria's story were beginning to feel like a puzzle, with several critical components missing or deliberately obscured. Throughout the morning, as Gary worked on fine-tuning the cardiac device's control algorithms, he noticed other subtle anomalies that his single-parenthood hypervigilance couldn't ignore. Aria's questions weren't just curious, they were sophisticated and targeted, suggesting she understood underlying engineering principles far better than she pretended. When Gary explained the relationship between pump pressure and cardiac output, Aria nodded with comprehension of someone who had heard similar explanations before, while Miguel asked the kind of clarifying questions that indicated genuine learning. "The ejection fraction optimization is really elegant," Aria commented during one technical discussion, then immediately startled as if the words had escaped without permission. "The way you make the heart pump better is really smart." Gary's suspicions crystallized at that moment. Ejection fraction wasn't terminology that appeared in children's medical explanations or parenting resources. It was a precise clinical measurement indicating the percentage of blood pumped out of the heart's left ventricle with each beat, something typically discussed only among medical professionals or patients receiving specialized cardiac care. Miguel looked between his father and Aria with growing confusion. "Papa, what's ejection fraction? And why did Aria know that word if it's something doctors use?" The question hung in the air, highlighting the disparity between Miguel's age-appropriate confusion and Aria's slip into advanced medical terminology. Gary realized that his son's presence had become an unintentional truth-testing mechanism. Miguel's genuine questions revealed the gaps in Aria's carefully maintained persona.
During lunch break, while both children were napping in the office area, another behavior that struck Gary as oddly synchronized, he decided to conduct some discreet investigation. He called Dr. Williams, ostensibly to discuss medical monitoring protocols, but actually to probe for information about the Sinclair family's medical history. "Rachel, I've been working with this family for several days now, and something feels incomplete about their story. Have you treated Aria Sinclair before, or do you know anything about their medical background that might affect our device design?" Dr. Williams was quiet for a long moment. "Gary, I've been wondering about inconsistencies myself. I checked with the regional medical database,
and there's no record of an Aria Sinclair matching our patient's description receiving treatment at any local facilities. That's unusual for a child with advanced cardiac failure. There should be extensive documentation from emergency visits, specialist consultations, medication prescriptions. The implications of this information sent a chill through Gary's chest, amplified by his single father's protective instincts. Either the Sinclair family had sought medical care under different names, or they had received treatment through channels that didn't appear in standard medical databases. Both possibilities suggested circumstances far more complex than Carmen had described, and Gary's parental radar was screaming warnings about adults who weren't truthful about children's medical histories. His next investigation involved examining the personal items that Aria routinely brought to the garage, but now with Miguel's innocent observations providing additional insight. His son had mentioned that Aria's backpack contained really cool electronic stuff that was way better than anything at school. When Gary discreetly examined the bag's contents during another nap period, he found items that raised more questions than they answered. A smartphone that was clearly top of the line, despite Carmen's claims of financial hardship. Medical monitoring equipment that looked far more sophisticated than anything typically available to patients managing heart failure at home. Most puzzling was a small leather portfolio containing detailed medical charts and test results, but written in multiple languages and bearing letterheads from medical institutions that Gary didn't recognize. The breakthrough in Gary's growing suspicions came that afternoon when he overheard a phone conversation that Aria thought was private, but Miguel's presence in the adjacent office area had made confidentiality impossible. The child had stepped into the garage's small bathroom area to take what she claimed was a call from her mother, but both Gary and Miguel could hear fragments of the conversation through the thin walls. The integration parameters look promising. The pressure differential calculations are within acceptable ranges, and the biocompatibility testing should conclude within 48 hours. Yes, I understand the timeline constraints, but the subject appears to be responding well to the fabrication process. Gary felt his blood run cold, while Miguel looked at him with wide, confused eyes. Aria was discussing the cardiac device project using language that belonged in a research laboratory, not in a conversation between a child and her mother. The terminology was precise, clinical, and completely inconsistent with everything Gary thought he knew about his patient. "Papa," Miguel whispered, "why is Aria talking like the doctors talked when Mama was in the hospital? And what does subject mean? Is she talking about herself?" When Aria returned from the phone call, reverting immediately to her usual childlike manner, Gary found himself studying both children with new eyes. The physical symptoms were undeniably real. The labored breathing, the fatigue, the cardiac distress were genuine medical conditions that required intervention. But the persona, the backstory, the family circumstances appeared to be carefully constructed fiction. Miguel's presence had become unexpectedly valuable in this investigation. His questions were innocent but penetrating, his observations unfiltered by adult assumptions. "Aria, who are you talking to? You sounded different, like when my teacher talks to the principal about grown-up school stuff." Aria's composure flickered again, and Gary saw her calculating how to respond to a child's direct question without raising further suspicion. "Just my mama, talking about medical things. Sometimes I have to use big words when we discuss my heart treatment." But Miguel's expression showed he wasn't satisfied with this explanation. "My papa uses big words when he talks to Dr. Williams about medical stuff, but you sounded like you were the doctor, not the patient." Gary's mind raced through the implications of what his investigation had revealed. If Aria wasn't who she claimed to be, then what was the real purpose of this elaborate deception? Was Gary being tested in some way? Was the cardiac device project actually some kind of research trial that he had unknowingly agreed to participate in? Most disturbing of all, if Aria's identity was fabricated, was her medical condition also exaggerated or manipulated? The ethical implications were staggering, particularly when viewed through the lens of single parenthood. Gary had involved his own child in what he believed was a humanitarian effort to save a dying stranger's life. If that stranger was actually part of some elaborate test or research protocol, then both Gary and Miguel had been manipulated into participating in deception that could have legal, financial, and emotional consequences for their family. Yet, as Gary watched Aria struggle to catch her breath after a simple walk across the garage, he couldn't deny that the child's physical distress was authentic. Whatever deception might be at play, Aria's cardiac condition was real and serious. The device Gary was building would genuinely save or extend this child's life, regardless of who she really was or why she had sought his help through elaborate fiction.
Miguel's innocent questions had become an unexpected asset in uncovering truth, but they also highlighted Gary's responsibility to protect his son from adult deception and manipulation. As evening approached and Carmen arrived to collect Aria, Gary found himself scrutinizing their interaction more carefully, while also shielding Miguel from his growing suspicions about the authenticity of everything they had been told. Gary made a decision that would define the final phase of the project. He would continue building the cardiac device with the same dedication and skill that he had committed from the beginning, but he would also begin preparing himself and Miguel for revelations that might fundamentally alter their understanding of everything that had happened over the past week. Whatever secrets Aria and Carmen were keeping, Gary was determined to see the medical project through to completion while protecting his son from the potential consequences of adult deception. December 21st arrived with a bitter wind that rattled the garage windows and a sense of urgency that had reached fever pitch. The cardiac assist device was complete except for final calibration, its sleek housing gleaming under the workshop lights, like something that belonged in a cutting-edge medical facility, rather than an automotive repair shop where a single father was trying to balance saving a life with preparing his son for Christmas morning. Miguel had woken early without prompting, helping Gary organize tools with the quiet efficiency of a child who understood that something monumentally important was happening. The sight of his 10-year-old son methodically arranging precision instruments while humming Christmas carols created a surreal atmosphere that perfectly captured the intersection of ordinary family life and extraordinary circumstances that had defined the past weeks. But it was the events of that morning that would test Gary's integrity in ways he never could have anticipated, revealing the true depth of the elaborate scenario that had been constructed around both him and his son. The first test came at 7:15 a.m. when Gary discovered an envelope that had been slipped under his garage door during the night. Inside was a cashier's check for $75,000 made out to Miguel Ruiz Educational Trust Fund with a note written in elegant handwriting. "For a child's future and a father's sacrifice, with deepest gratitude for services rendered. A grateful friend." Gary stared at the check while Miguel peered over his shoulder, both of them processing the implications in different ways. $75,000 would solve every financial problem Gary faced: the overdue utilities, the borrowed money for device components, the lost income from neglecting regular customers. More importantly, it would secure Miguel's college education, providing opportunities that Gary had only dared hope for during his most optimistic moments. "Papa, that's more money than we've ever seen," Miguel said with the awed voice of a child who understood the magnitude of their family's financial struggles. "Does this mean I can go to engineering school like you always wanted?" But the timing felt deliberate, manipulative, almost like another piece in whatever elaborate puzzle was being constructed around their family. Who in Millbrook had access to $75,000 in cash? And why would they choose to help anonymously rather than openly supporting the project that had galvanized the entire community? Gary photographed the check and note, then locked them in his office safe without depositing them. If this was another test of his motivations, he was determined to complete the project based on his original commitment to help a dying child, not because of financial incentives that had mysteriously appeared. "Miguel, we're going to hold on to this for now. I want to make sure we're helping Aria for the right reasons, not because someone is paying us to do it." Miguel nodded with the serious understanding of a child who had learned about moral complexity during his mother's illness. "Like when the insurance company wanted to pay you to stop taking Mama to the expensive doctors, but you said some things can't be bought." The comparison hit Gary hard, remembering those desperate months when financial pressures had threatened to compromise Maria's care. "Exactly like that, mijo.
Some decisions have to come from the heart, not from the bank account. The second test arrived an hour later in the form of Dr. Amanda Foster, who introduced herself as a representative from the State Medical Board investigating reports of unlicensed medical procedures being performed in Gary's garage. But what immediately raised Gary's suspicions was Miguel's reaction to her presence. His son seemed genuinely confused by the woman's authority, asking direct questions that revealed inconsistencies in her presentation. Miss Rodriguez, I'm sure you understand that what you're attempting here raises serious legal and ethical concerns. Cardiac assist devices require FDA approval, surgical implantation by licensed physicians, and extensive safety protocols that simply cannot be maintained in this environment. It's Mr. Ruiz, not Rodriguez, Miguel corrected politely, displaying the attention to detail that Gary had encouraged since early childhood. And my papa isn't doing surgery. He's building a machine to help Aria's heart work better, like building a special engine for a race car. Gary had been dreading this confrontation since the project began, but Miguel's presence changed the dynamic entirely. His aunt's innocent questions and corrections revealed gaps in Dr. Foster's knowledge that suggested her investigation wasn't as thorough as it should have been. Doctor, I'm not performing surgery or claiming to practice medicine. I'm building a mechanical device under medical supervision with informed consent from the patient's family in a desperate situation where conventional medical care has been financially inaccessible. My son Miguel has been observing the entire process as part of his education in engineering and community service.
Dr. Foster pulled out a tablet and began reviewing what appeared to be detailed documentation of the project. But Gary noticed that Miguel was studying her with the intense focus he usually reserved for people whose stories didn't quite make sense. "Papa," Miguel whispered, "if she's from the medical board, why doesn't she know our name? And why does her paperwork look like the fake forms I made for my school project about government agencies?" Gary's suspicions crystallized around his son's observations. Dr. Foster's knowledge of specific technical details was too comprehensive for a regulatory investigation that should have relied on external reports, and her documentation appeared more like surveillance records than official medical board findings. "Miss Foster, I'm prepared to cooperate fully with any legitimate investigation, but I need to verify your credentials and ensure that my son's involvement in this project is properly documented for child protection purposes." Dr. Foster's expression flickered slightly, and Gary recognized the tell of someone whose script hadn't anticipated complications from a protective single father. "Mr. Ruiz, I'm prepared to offer you a way out of this situation that protects both you and your son, as well as the child you're trying to help. We have arrangements with several medical centers that could provide immediate, proper treatment for the patient. All you need to do is step away from this project and allow qualified medical professionals to take over." The offer should have been a relief. Gary would be freed from legal liability, financial burden, and the crushing responsibility of a child's life hanging in the balance of his experimental engineering. But Miguel's continued skeptical observations kept Gary focused on inconsistencies in the presentation. "What happens to the machine my papa built?" Miguel asked with the direct honesty that Gary had learned to trust implicitly. All the work, the new ideas, the things he figured out that nobody else knew how to do. Dr. Foster's hesitation before answering confirmed Gary's growing suspicions that this wasn't a straightforward regulatory intervention. The device would be evaluated by our technical team. If it shows promise, it could potentially be developed further through proper clinical trials and regulatory approval processes. Of course, any intellectual property or design innovations would need to be properly documented and credited. Gary's parental instincts, honed by years of protecting Miguel from various forms of adult manipulation, immediately identified the flaw in this proposition. Dr. Foster was essentially offering to take over the project at the moment of completion, removing Gary from recognition or control over innovations that had emerged from his own expertise, resources, and family sacrifice. The third and most revealing test came that afternoon, when Aria arrived for what Gary had planned as the device's final fitting and calibration session. But Miguel's presence transformed what might have been a private revelation into a moment of truth that would define all their relationships going forward. "Mr. Gary, I need to tell you and Miguel something important before we finish the device."
Gary paused in his preparation of the sterile workspace, sensing that whatever Aria was about to reveal would be significant. Miguel moved closer to his father, displaying the protective positioning that had become instinctive during moments of potential family crisis. "What is it, sweetheart?" asked Gary, placing a protective hand on Miguel's shoulder. Aria looked directly at both father and son with eyes that suddenly seemed far older than her 8 years. "I know you've been wondering about things that don't add up, about my medical knowledge, about how I got here so early, about the phone calls I've been making. Miguel's questions have been really smart, and I think you both deserve to know the truth." The directness of the statement caught Gary off guard, but Miguel's immediate response revealed how much his son had been processing about the inconsistencies they'd observed. "Are you really sick, or were you pretending?" Miguel asked with the blunt honesty that Gary had learned to appreciate during difficult family conversations. "My heart condition is completely real. I do have advanced heart failure, and I really could die without help. But my name isn't Aria Sinclair, and my family isn't poor. My real name is Aria Thorne, and my father is Dr. Marcus Thorne." Gary felt the world tilt slightly around him, but it was Miguel's immediate questions that kept him grounded in practical concerns. The famous heart doctor from the medical shows? The one who invented all those machines that help people's hearts? Miguel's eyes widened as he made the connection. "But if your papa is super rich and famous, why did you need my papa to build you a heart machine?" Aria's expression grew sad but determined as she looked at this 10-year-old who had just asked the essential question. "Because my father wanted to find someone who would try to save a child's life simply because it was the right thing to do, not because they were paid to do it or because they wanted to be famous. He's been watching everything through cameras hidden in your garage, Miguel. He wanted to see if anyone would really help a stranger." Gary looked at his son, seeing Miguel process this information with the analytical skills they'd developed together during countless problem-solving sessions. "So your papa was testing my papa? Like a big test to see if he's a good person?" "Yes," Aria admitted, then looked directly at Gary. "But everything else, our friendship, your kindness, the way you included Miguel in everything and taught us both about helping people, that was all real. The test was just about whether you would help someone you thought couldn't pay you back. Everything else was true."
Gary realized that his son's presence throughout this entire experience had been the key to uncovering truth while maintaining authentic relationships. Miguel's questions had revealed deception, but his genuine friendship with Aria had preserved what was real and valuable about their connection. "The device is ready for testing," Gary said finally, looking at both children. "Are you ready to find out if a small-town mechanic and his son can build something that works as well as what billion-dollar research facilities produce?" The sound that announced the arrival of Gary's new reality was unlike anything Millbrook had ever experienced. The distinctive whine of turbofan engines operating at low altitude, growing steadily louder until it seemed to fill the entire sky above the small industrial town. Gary instinctively pulled Miguel closer to his side as they looked up from their final device calibrations to see Aria's expression transform from nervous anticipation to something resembling relief, mixed with the kind of apprehension a child feels when facing a difficult conversation with their parents. "He's here," Aria said simply, her small voice barely audible above the approaching aircraft, while Miguel pressed against his father's side with the protective instinct that had developed during their weeks of working together on this impossible project. Through the garage's large windows, Gary watched a sleek medical jet descend toward the empty lot adjacent to his building, the same lot where Miguel sometimes played catch while waiting for his father to finish evening repairs. But this was no ordinary aircraft. The jet's pristine white fuselage bore the distinctive red cross of medical transport, and Gary could see sophisticated external equipment pods that suggested this aircraft was essentially a flying intensive care unit worth more than his entire neighborhood. Miguel's grip on his father's arm tightened as the reality of what they were witnessing began to sink in. "Papa, is that like the helicopter that took Mama to the big hospital, but bigger and fancier?" Gary's throat constricted at the comparison, remembering the desperate ambulance ride that had been their family's introduction to high-level medical intervention. "Yes, mijo, but this one is designed to bring help to patients instead of taking patients away for help."
As the engine spooled down and the aircraft's system settled into ground operations mode, Gary found himself frozen between his workbench and the window, clutching the cardiac device that represented weeks of his family's most intense work. The elegant machine in his hands suddenly felt primitive compared to the millions of dollars worth of medical technology that had just landed outside his humble garage. But McGill's steady presence reminded him that value wasn't always measured in dollars or sophistication. The jet's passenger door opened with hydraulic precision, and Gary watched a figure emerge who commanded attention even at a distance. Dr. Marcus Thorne was tall and impeccably dressed in what appeared to be surgical scrubs beneath a tailored overcoat. His silver hair and distinguished bearing conveyed exactly the kind of authority Gary would expect from someone whose medical innovations had saved thousands of lives worldwide. "Papa, he looks like the doctors on the medical shows, but more serious," McGill whispered, displaying the analytical observation skills that had made him such an effective truth detector throughout this elaborate deception. But it was Dr. Thorne's entourage that truly demonstrated the scale of resources that had been brought to bear on this situation. Behind him came what appeared to be a complete cardiac surgical team, an anesthesiologist wheeling portable monitoring equipment that dwarfed Gary's improvised diagnostic systems, a cardiovascular surgeon carrying what looked like a full surgical kit worth more than Gary's annual income, and 2 nurses managing advanced life support systems that made Gary's homemade device look like a high school science project. Miguel tugged on his father's sleeve. "Papa, if Aria's real father has all these doctors and machines, why did she need us to build her a heart helper? Did we waste our time?" The question cut to the heart of Gary's growing confusion and concern. Dr. Rachel Williams appeared at Gary's shoulder, having arrived through the back entrance without either father or son noticing in their absorption with the arriving medical team. "I've been expecting this," she said quietly, placing a reassuring hand on Miguel's head. "Dr. Thorne contacted me 3 days ago to discuss providing medical backup for your device testing. He's been monitoring Aria's condition remotely through sensors that were embedded in her clothing and that backpack she carries everywhere." Gary turned to stare at Dr. Williams, while McGill's eyes widened with the fascination of a child discovering that adults had been conducting sophisticated operations beyond his awareness. "You knew who she was? This entire time you knew Miguel and I were being tested?" "I suspected after the first day," Dr. Williams admitted, crouching to Miguel's eye level. The sophistication of Aria's medical knowledge, the quality of her monitoring equipment, the way she understood cardiac physiology, it didn't match the story Carmen had told. But I also saw that your father's commitment to helping her was completely genuine, and I knew that regardless of who she was, she needed the device you two were building. Miguel processed his information with the directness that Gary had learned to respect. "So you were helping us help her, even though you knew she was lying about being poor?" "I was helping your father save a little girl's life, Miguel. Sometimes the most important truths are the simple ones."
Through the window, Gary watched Dr. Thorne approach the garage with measured steps, his expression unreadable, but his posture suggesting someone prepared for a complex conversation. Carmen appeared beside him, but this wasn't the exhausted cleaning woman Gary and Miguel had come to know over the past weeks. This Carmen moved with professional confidence, wore clothing that was clearly expensive despite its casual appearance, and carried herself like someone accustomed to high-stakes medical environments. "Papa," Miguel said quietly, "Carmen looks different too. Like when you dress up for parent-teacher conferences, but she's dressed up for doctor meetings." The truth hit Gary with crystalline clarity. Carmen wasn't Aria's struggling single mother. She was Dr. Thorne's colleague, possibly his research partner, playing a role in this elaborate test with the same commitment to authenticity that Gary had brought to building the cardiac device. The realization that even Miguel's innocent interactions with Carmen had been part of her performance added a layer of complexity to Gary's feelings about the deception. Dr. Thorne paused at the garage entrance, taking in the transformed workspace with eyes that missed nothing.
Gary could see him cataloging every piece of equipment, every modification they had made to accommodate medical-grade precision in an automotive environment, every innovation that had emerged from Gary's unique combination of mechanical expertise and desperate determination, enhanced by Miguel's practical suggestions and moral support. "Mr. Ruiz," Dr. Thorne said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in operating rooms and boardrooms alike. His gaze shifted to include Miguel with respectful attention that adults should show children who have contributed meaningfully to important work. "And Miguel, I believe we all have much to discuss." Miguel stepped slightly forward, displaying the courage that Gary had been fostering throughout this project. "Are you here to take Aria away now? Because my papa made her a really good heart machine, and she's our friend, even if she lied about some things." Dr. Thorne's expression softened slightly at Miguel's directness. "I'm here to see your father's work, Miguel, and to apologize to both of you for the deception that was necessary to observe that work properly." Gary found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "Dr. Thorne, I assume you're here to evaluate whether a small-town mechanic and a 10-year-old assistant have managed to build something that meets your standards." Something flickered across Dr. Thorne's expression, surprise perhaps at Gary's inclusion of Miguel as a legitimate contributor rather than just a bystander. "Actually, Mr. Ruiz, I'm here to apologize for the deception that was necessary to observe your work properly, and to offer both you and Miguel an opportunity that I believe will interest you considerably." He gestured to one of his team members, who immediately began setting up what appeared to be a comprehensive cardiac monitoring station that would interface with both Aria's condition and Gary's device. "But first, I would very much like to see your device in operation. Aria's condition has deteriorated significantly over the past 24 hours, and time has become critically important." Gary looked at Aria, who had remained quietly in her corner throughout this revelation, watching the interaction between her father and Gary's family with intense focus. Despite everything Gary had learned about the deception, despite his anger at being manipulated and tested, the child's obvious distress was undeniably real, and Miguel's friendship with her had created emotional stakes that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. "The device is ready for testing," Gary said, lifting the cardiac assist unit from his workbench, while Miguel moved to support the connecting cables with practiced efficiency. "But I have conditions." Dr. Thorne's eyebrows rose slightly. "Conditions?" "Complete transparency from this point forward. No more deception, no more hidden agendas, no more tests that Miguel and I are unaware of participating in. If we're going to save Aria's life, we do it as partners, not as examiner and subjects. And Miguel gets credit as my co-engineer on this project. He contributed ideas and observations that improved the final design." Miguel beamed at his father's recognition, while Dr. Thorne studied both father and son for a long moment. Gary could see him reassessing everything he thought he knew about their character and capabilities. "Agreed. Complete transparency and full recognition for Miguel's contributions." Gary moved to Aria's side with Miguel beside him, both of them kneeling beside the child's chair with the device in Gary's hands. "Are you ready for this, Aria? Not the test subject, not the billionaire's daughter, just you, our friend, the brave little girl who walked into our garage asking for help." Aria reached out to touch the device, her fingers tracing the smooth surfaces that Gary and Miguel had crafted with such care. "I'm ready, Mr. Gary and Miguel, and thank you for still wanting to help me, even after you found out I wasn't who I pretended to be." Dr. Thorne began connecting his monitoring equipment to track Aria's cardiac function in real time, while Gary and Miguel prepared to activate the device that would either prove their weeks of work had been successful or demonstrate the limits of what determination, ingenuity, and father-son collaboration could accomplish against the challenges of advanced medical technology. "Mr. Ruiz," Dr. Thorne said as he worked, his tone including Miguel in the conversation, I want you both to understand that this test was never about whether you could build something equivalent to what my laboratories produce. It was about finding people who approached medical engineering with genuine compassion rather than commercial motivation. The technical specifications of your device are impressive, but what convinced me to come here personally was watching you work 18-hour days for someone you believed couldn't pay you a single dollar, while still maintaining your responsibilities as a father and including your son in a meaningful educational experience.
Gary looked up from his final device preparations to meet Dr. Thorne's eyes, while Miguel watched both adults with the intense attention of a child who understood that important truths were being shared. "And what did that prove to you, Doctor?" Dr. Thorne smiled for the first time since entering the garage, and Gary could see where Aria had inherited her intelligence and determination. It proved that the most important innovations in medical technology don't come from having the most expensive equipment or the largest research budgets. They come from having the biggest heart, the most stubborn refusal to accept that someone can't be helped, and the wisdom to include the next generation in work that matters. As Gary and Miguel activated their homemade cardiac assist device together and watched Aria's vital signs immediately stabilize on Dr. Thorne's sophisticated monitors, Gary realized that both his life and Miguel's understanding of what was possible in the world were about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But more importantly, he realized that regardless of the deception and testing that had brought them together, they had just saved the life of a child who needed their help. And sometimes that simple truth was more valuable than any amount of money, recognition, or sophisticated technology. The medical monitoring equipment filled Gary's garage with a symphony of electronic sounds that transported him back to the worst days of Maria's illness, but Miguel's steady presence beside him provided an anchor that helped him process the overwhelming reality of what they had just accomplished. The cardiac assist device was working perfectly. Aria's vital signs had stabilized to levels they hadn't seen since her first day in the garage, and yet the emotional aftermath of the elaborate deception left Gary struggling to separate his anger at being manipulated from his relief at having saved a child's life. "Papa," Miguel said quietly, watching the monitors display Aria's improved cardiac function with the fascinated attention of a child who had contributed to making those numbers possible. "Are you mad at Aria and her real papa for lying to us? Because I keep thinking about how scared she must have been, pretending to be someone else while her heart was getting sicker." The question cut straight to the heart of Gary's internal conflict. His son's ability to focus on emotional truth despite adult complexity reminded Gary of why he'd committed to this project in the first place, not because of who Aria claimed to be, but because a dying child had asked for help. Miguel's perspective helped Gary realize that his anger wasn't really about the deception itself, but about the violation of trust that occurred when adults manipulated children's relationships for their own purposes. Dr. Thorne had been observing the father-son interaction while monitoring his daughter's response to the device, and Gary could see the cardiac surgeon reassessing his understanding of the family dynamics he had been studying from a distance. "Mr. Ruiz, I owe you and Miguel a more complete explanation of why this test was necessary and what it revealed about both your technical capabilities and your character." Gary looked up from adjusting the device's pressure settings, with Miguel immediately mirroring his father's attention to ensure he didn't miss any part of this crucial conversation. "Dr. Thorne, before you explain anything else, I need you to understand something about my family. Miguel has been my partner in this project, not just an observer. He's contributed ideas, asked questions that improved the design, and made sacrifices to help save your daughter's life. Whatever explanation you give, it needs to acknowledge that you tested both of us, and any consequences or opportunities that result need to include both of us."
Miguel straightened with pride at his father's recognition, while Dr. Thorne nodded with the kind of respect that Gary rarely saw adults show toward children's contributions. You're absolutely right, and I apologize for not recognizing Miguel's partnership from the beginning. The surveillance footage showed clearly that this was a collaborative effort between father and son. Surveillance footage? Miguel asked, with the directness that Gary had learned to appreciate. You mean like security cameras? Were you watching us the whole time, even when we were working late and Papa was teaching me about pressure dynamics? Dr. Thorne's expression grew somewhat uncomfortable. Yes, Miguel, we had cameras installed throughout the garage to document every aspect of the project. I needed to verify that the assistance being provided was genuine and consistent, not performance that might change when you thought no one was watching. Gary felt his protective instincts flare at the realization that his most vulnerable moments as a single father, the late nights when exhaustion had made him emotional, the times when he'd struggled to balance Miguel's needs with the project's demands, had all been recorded and analyzed by strangers. You documented my parenting, my family's private moments without our consent. That's not just deception, Dr. Thorne. That's invasion of privacy that involved my minor child. The garage fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitoring equipment and the soft hum of Gary's cardiac assist device working in perfect synchronization with Aria's heartbeat. Miguel moved closer to his father, displaying the protective positioning that had become instinctive during moments of family stress. You're absolutely right, and I take full responsibility for that violation. The medical and engineering communities have become so focused on preventing fraud and ensuring reproducible results that we sometimes lose sight of ethical boundaries. Watching your family navigate this challenge taught me something I didn't expect to learn.
Carmen, who had been quietly managing Aria's comfort during the device installation, stepped forward with an expression that seemed more authentic than any Gary had seen from her during the weeks of deception. Mr. Ruiz, Miguel, I need to apologize too. I'm Dr. Thorne's research director, and I volunteered to play the role of Aria's mother because I thought I understood what we were testing. But I didn't anticipate how genuine your concern for our welfare would be, or how Miguel's involvement would complicate my feelings about the deception we were conducting. Miguel looked between the adults with the analytical expression that Gary recognized as his son's way of processing complex emotional information. So, you felt bad about lying to us because we were being nice to you? Like when I feel bad about not telling Papa the whole truth about something, even when I have a good reason? The comparison was simple but accurate, and Gary could see both Dr. Thorne and Carmen recognizing the moral complexity that children often understood more clearly than adults. Carmen knelt beside Miguel's chair, speaking to him with the respect that Gary insisted all adults show his son. Yes, Miguel, exactly like that. The longer we spent with you and your father, the more we realized that what we were studying wasn't just technical capability or professional ethics. We were witnessing something much more important, a family choosing to help a stranger despite personal cost, and including their child in understanding what it means to serve others. Dr. Rachel Williams, who had been quietly documenting the device's performance, looked up from her medical notes. Gary, Miguel, there's something else you should know about the testing process. Dr. Thorne's team also investigated your background extensively. They know about Maria's illness, your financial struggles, your reputation in the community. This wasn't just about building a cardiac device. It was about finding people whose motivation for helping others had been tested by real hardship. Miguel's eyes widened as he processed this information. They know about Mama? About how sick she was, and how Papa took care of her and me at the same time? Gary felt a complex mix of violation and validation. His most difficult experiences as a husband and father had been examined and evaluated by strangers, but apparently those experiences had demonstrated something valuable about his character and capabilities. Miguel,
Dr. Thorne said, crouching to the child's eye level with the careful attention that Gary appreciated when adults took his son seriously. Your father's dedication to your mother during her illness and his success in raising you as a single parent while maintaining his business and serving his community told us that he had exactly the kind of character we needed for this project. But more than that, watching him include you as a real partner in helping Aria showed us something we hadn't expected to find. What did you find? Miguel asked with the curiosity that Gary had always encouraged. We found that the most important innovations come from families and communities working together, not from individuals working in isolation. Your questions improved the device's design. Your friendship with Aria helped her cope with the stress of her condition. Your father's teaching helped all of us understand that medical technology should serve human relationships, not replace them. Gary looked around the garage, seeing it through new eyes. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save one child's life had become something larger, a demonstration of community capability, family resilience, and the power of including children in meaningful work rather than protecting them from adult responsibilities. Aria, who had been quietly listening while adjusting to her new device, spoke up with a voice that seemed stronger than it had been in weeks. Mr. Gary, Miguel, I need you to know that becoming friends with you wasn't part of the test. My papa told me to observe your technical work and report on your methods, but nobody told me to care about whether Miguel liked me, or whether you worried about my feelings, or whether you included me in conversations like I was a real person instead of just a patient. The simple authenticity of Miguel's response seemed to cut through all the adult complexity surrounding the elaborate test. Gary realized that his son had maintained the essential truth throughout the deception, that helping others and building genuine relationships was more important than understanding all the circumstances that brought people together. Dr. Thorne, I need to understand what happens now. Miguel and I have invested weeks of our lives, our financial resources, and our emotional energy in helping your daughter. The device works, Aria is stable, and apparently we've passed whatever test you designed. But my primary responsibility is still to my son and our community. Whatever opportunities you're offering need to align with those priorities. Dr. Thorne stood, looking at the father and son who had just demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity and capability he had been seeking. Mr. Ruiz, Miguel, what happens now is that you get to choose how you want to change the world. Because based on what I've observed, you have the technical skills, the ethical foundation, and the collaborative approach that could revolutionize how we develop and deliver medical technology. The question is whether you're interested in thinking bigger than just Millbrook.
Gary looked at his son, seeing Miguel's excitement tempered by the same cautious evaluation that had served their family well during difficult times. Whatever decision they made would affect not just their own future, but their commitment to the community that had supported them and the values that had guided them through this extraordinary experience. 6 months later, Gary stood in the gleaming new Millbrook Medical Innovation Center, watching Miguel demonstrate the latest version of their cardiac assist device to a group of visiting medical students from 3 different countries. The facility had risen from the empty lot where Dr. Thorne's medical jet had first landed, but it bore no resemblance to a traditional corporate medical facility. Instead, it looked remarkably like an expanded version of Gary's original garage. Workstations designed around collaboration rather than hierarchy, tools arranged for teaching rather than just production, and windows positioned so that the entire community could observe and participate in the revolutionary work happening inside. Miguel, now 11 and serving as the official junior engineer for the Ruiz-Thorne Medical Partnership, moved through his presentation with the confidence of a child who had learned that his ideas mattered to adults who changed the world. The students hung on his every word as he explained how automotive hydraulic principles had been adapted for cardiac assist,
how community input had improved user interface design, and why every device they produced included features that preserved patient dignity alongside biological function. "The most important part," Miguel said, adjusting the demonstration model with practiced ease, "isn't the technical stuff, though that has to be perfect. The most important part is that every person who gets one of our devices feels like we built it specifically for them, because we kind of did. My papa and I interview every patient, learn their stories, and customize each device for how they actually live their lives." Gary watched from the doorway, feeling the same pride he'd experienced during Miguel's first science fair presentation, but amplified by the knowledge that his son was now teaching concepts that would be implemented in medical centers worldwide. The transformation of their lives had been extraordinary, but it had occurred on terms that preserved everything Gary valued most about their family and community relationships. The partnership with Dr. Thorne had indeed revolutionized medical device development, but not in the way anyone had initially expected. Rather than scaling up production to compete with existing manufacturers, they had created a model based on personalized engineering that was being replicated in communities across the globe. Small teams of craftspeople worked directly with patients to create custom solutions, combining local expertise with advanced materials and global knowledge sharing. Millbrook itself had become an unlikely destination for medical tourism, but the kind that brought families to experience hope rather than desperation. Patients came not just for devices, but for the collaborative approach that treated medical challenges as engineering problems to be solved together, rather than conditions to be managed separately. The town's population had stabilized and begun growing for the first time in decades, as young professionals moved to Millbrook specifically to join what had become known as compassionate technology development. Carmen, whose real name turned out to be Dr. Carmen Vasquez, had become Gary's closest professional collaborator and one of Miguel's favorite adults. Her expertise in biomedical research, combined with Gary's mechanical innovations and Miguel's practical insights, had produced devices that consistently outperformed anything created by traditional medical equipment manufacturers. More importantly, their collaboration had resulted in a new model for medical research that treated patients as partners rather than subjects. "Mr. Gary," Aria called out as she entered the demonstration area, moving with the easy confidence of a healthy child whose custom device had become as natural as breathing. She was now 9, thriving in a special program that split her time between regular elementary school and advanced engineering classes designed for young people who had personal experience with medical technology. "Miguel's presentation is really good, but he forgot to mention the best part about how you two work together." Gary smiled, recognizing the dynamic that had developed between the children over their months of friendship. Aria had appointed herself the unofficial biographer of the Ruiz family's approach to engineering, and she never missed an opportunity to highlight aspects of their work that the adults might take for granted. "What did Miguel forget to mention?" one of the visiting students asked, clearly charmed by Aria's confidence and expertise. "He forgot to say that his papa never makes any important decisions without asking Miguel what he thinks. And Miguel always asks really good questions that make the grown-ups realize they missed something important. Like, they're not just father and son, they're actually partners who make each other smarter." Miguel blushed, but didn't contradict her assessment. The months of working together had indeed created a professional partnership that transcended their family relationship while strengthening it. Miguel's questions consistently revealed design flaws that adult experts had missed, while Gary's teaching approach ensured that his son understood not just how to build medical devices, but why certain approaches served patients better than others. Dr. Thorne appeared beside Gary, carrying the satisfied expression of someone whose most optimistic projections had been exceeded. The cardiac surgeon had relocated his primary research operations to Millbrook, building a state-of-the-art medical facility that functioned as both hospital and teaching center. His own transformation had been as significant as Gary's, from a corporate medical researcher focused on scalable technologies to a practitioner of what he now called artisanal medicine. "Gary, I just got off a call with the World Health Organization. They want to establish 50 more Millbrook model centers over the next 3 years, with each one led by local craftspeople who understand their community's specific needs. They're asking if you and Miguel would be willing to travel to help train the initial teams."
Gary considered the offer, but not for the reasons he would have 6 months earlier. Financial security was no longer a concern. The Ruiz family's innovations had generated income streams that ensured Miguel's education and their community's stability for decades to come. The question now was whether expanding their work globally would enhance or diminish their ability to maintain the personal relationships that had made their approach successful. "Miguel, what do you think?" Gary asked, including his son in the decision with the same respect he showed to Dr. Thorne's medical expertise. Miguel paused his demonstration to consider the question with the seriousness that both father and son brought to choices that affected other families. "Papa, remember when you taught me that the best way to help lots of people is to help them learn how to help themselves? Maybe we could teach other papas and mamas and kids how to do what we do, so they can help people in their own communities." Gary nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his son's analysis. "So we're not just building more devices, we're teaching more families how to solve problems together." "Exactly," Miguel replied. "Like when you taught me how to fix Mrs. Patterson's car, and then I could help other kids learn how to fix their bikes. We share the knowledge, not just the products." Dr. Thorne smiled at the exchange, having learned to appreciate the practical philosophy that emerged from the father-son collaboration. The WHO specifically requested that training teams include families, not just individual practitioners. They've studied your model extensively, and they believe that the parent-child teaching dynamic is essential to replicating your success. Aria, who had been listening with the intense focus she brought to discussions of medical innovation, raised her hand with the formality she still maintained when asking important questions. "Dr. Thorne, if Mr. Gary and Miguel teach other families how to build heart helpers, does that mean there will be lots more kids like Miguel who get to help save people's lives?" "That's exactly what it means, Aria. We're creating a generation of young people who understand that technology should serve human relationships and who have the skills to make that happen." Gary looked around the Innovation Center, seeing it filled with the next generation of medical engineers who had learned their foundational skills from parents, neighbors, and community members who treated problem-solving as a family activity. Miguel had begun teaching weekend classes for younger children, sharing both technical skills and the ethical framework that prioritized patient welfare above institutional interests. The partnership with Dr. Thorne had preserved everything Gary valued about small-town community life, while creating opportunities that neither he nor Miguel could have imagined. More importantly, it had validated Gary's belief that the best solutions to complex problems often came from unexpected combinations of expertise, compassion, and the kind of practical wisdom that emerged from real-world experience with hardship and resilience. "Dr. Thorne, Gary and Miguel accept your WHO proposal, but with our standard conditions. We work as a family team, we maintain our base of operations in Millbrook, and every community we help gets to keep control of their innovations rather than licensing them to us. Our goal is to create more communities like ours, not to build a medical device empire." Miguel nodded his agreement, then added his own condition with the confidence that Gary had spent years fostering. "And every program has to include kids as real partners, not just observers, because grown-ups don't always think of the best solutions when they're working by themselves." As Gary and Miguel began planning their global teaching mission, surrounded by friends and colleagues who had become extended family, Gary realized that Maria's death had ultimately led to something she would have been proud of, not just the preservation of their family's values and Miguel's moral education, but the creation of a legacy that demonstrated how personal loss could be transformed into community strength and global healing. The cardiac assist device that had started as a desperate attempt to save one child's life had become the foundation for a new approach to medical technology that prioritized relationships over profits, communities over corporations, and the wisdom of families over the authority of institutions. Miguel would grow up in a world where his contributions were valued, where his questions improved adult work,
and where the line between learning and teaching had become beautifully blurred. Outside the Innovation Center's windows, Millbrook bustled with activity that would have been impossible to imagine just months earlier, but the foundation remained the same. Neighbors helping neighbors, families working together, and the belief that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they combined their skills with their commitment to serving others. In Gary's pocket, the original $75,000 check remained uncashed, preserved as a reminder that the most valuable rewards couldn't be deposited in banks, but were measured in lives saved, communities strengthened, and children prepared to continue building a more compassionate world.